Some of you had fathers who came home from the Pacific. Some of you had uncles who did not. This is the story of a submarine most Americans have never heard of. And the man who commanded her, his name was Richard O'Kane. He was 33 years old. At 2:30 in the morning on October 25th, 1944, he stood on the bridge of the USS Tang in the black waters off the coast of China and pressed the firing key for the last torpedo he would ever launch in this war. 20 seconds later, the ocean betrayed him. Beside him, a 21-year-old boatswain's mate named Bill Leibold watched the torpedo's wake bend to the left, bending back, coming home. O'Kane had 8 seconds to save 87 men. He would save 9 of them. This is how they got there. And this is how they came home. To understand how the best American submarine commander of the Second World War ended up killed by his own weapon, you have to go back, not to the beginning of the war. Further, you have to go back to a time when the United States Navy looked at its own submarine force and saw a joke. They called them pigboats. The nickname was old, dating back to the First World War, when American submarines sat low and dirty in the water and stank of diesel and unwashed men. But the nickname stuck for a reason. In 1941, the submarine service made up less than 2% of the entire United States Navy. The battleship admirals ran the fleet. The aircraft carriers were the new glamour. Submarines were something you sent to do the small, ugly work that real ships didn't want. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and the battleships that were supposed to win the war were sitting on the bottom of the harbor in burning oil. And the Navy suddenly needed the pigboats to do something they had never been designed to do. Fight a war. There was only one problem. The torpedoes did not work. In the summer of 1943, a lieutenant commander named Lawrence Daspit took his submarine, the USS Tinosa, into the sea lanes between Truk and Borneo. On the afternoon of July 24th, Daspit found a target that most skippers only dreamed of. A Japanese tanker named Tonin Maru No. 3. 19,000 tons of steel and oil, moving at 10 knots, no escort, no zigzag, a gift. Daspit fired and fired and fired. He put 15 Mark 14 torpedoes into the water. 11 of them struck the tanker. None of them exploded. Daspit stood at his periscope and watched his warheads slam into the enemy's hull one after another and simply thud into the steel like thrown stones. He brought his last torpedo home in the tube, unfired, so the ordnance men at Pearl Harbor could take it apart and see what was wrong with it. The Bureau of Ordnance told him he had done it wrong. There was a submarine admiral in Pearl Harbor who had heard enough. His name was Charles Lockwood. He was 54 years old, a career submariner, and he was watching his men die because Washington would not admit that its weapons were broken. Lockwood said something in 1943 that submariners still quote today. If the Bureau of Ordnance cannot supply us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, then, for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design us a boat hook so we can rip the plates off the enemy's hulls. This was the American submarine force at the start of 1944. Broken weapons, cautious doctrine, a navy that treated them like an embarrassment. And into that force came Richard Hetherington O'Kane. He was born on the 2nd of February, 1911, in Dover, New Hampshire, the youngest of 4 children. He was not a large man. He was not loud. He carried himself like someone who had already done the arithmetic on every room he walked into. He went to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis and graduated in the class of 1934. He served on a cruiser and a destroyer. He learned surface warfare the way the Navy taught it, and he decided he did not like it. In 1938, he transferred to submarines. Nobody wanted submarines. That was the point. In the peacetime Navy, submarines were where careers went to die. But O'Kane had noticed something about the men who chose the Pigboats. They were smarter. They had to be. A destroyer captain could survive a mistake. A submarine captain buried his crew. In early 1942, O'Kane joined the pre-commissioning crew of a brand new fleet submarine called the USS Wahoo. He was 31 years old, a lieutenant, and he was made the executive officer. His first commanding officer was cautious. His second commanding officer was not. The second commanding officer was named Dudley Walker Morton. Everyone called him Mush. Mush Morton was 35 years old, and he was, without exaggeration, unlike any submarine commander the United States Navy had ever produced. Where the doctrine said, fire from 3,000 yards, Morton fired from 900. Where the doctrine said, avoid contact, Morton hunted contact. Where the doctrine said the captain looks through the periscope, Morton reversed it. He handed the periscope to his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, and he stood at the plotting table and ran the geometry. He told O'Kane, "This your eyes see the ship. Mine sees the shot. Together we are one commander." In late January of 1943, Morton and O'Kane took the Wahoo into the harbor at Wewak on the north coast of New Guinea. No American submarine had ever gone inside a defended Japanese harbor before. It was not done. It was suicide. Morton did it anyway. He sank a Japanese destroyer with a torpedo shot fired down the enemy's own throat as the destroyer charged them head on. And then he took the Wahoo out through the harbor mouth on the surface in daylight because he wanted the Japanese to see him leave. Under Morton, the Wahoo sank more tonnage in 9 months than most American submarines sank in the entire war. And beside Morton, at the periscope, O'Kane learned everything. He learned that speed is stealth. He learned that a submarine on the surface at 20 knots is harder to track than a submarine crawling at 5 knots below the thermal layer. He learned that fear kills more men than depth charges. He learned to read the rhythm of a convoy, the way a musician reads a metronome. He learned that the closer you fire, the less time the torpedo has to fail. And in July of 1943, after 5 war patrols on the Wahoo, O'Kane was promoted to lieutenant commander and given his own boat. She was still under construction. Her name was Tang. The USS Tang was a Palau-class fleet submarine built at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. She was 311 feet long. She could make more than 20 knots on the surface and 18 knots submerged. Her pressure hull was rated for 400 feet and had been tested past 600. She carried 24 torpedoes in 10 tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft. She was, in every measurable sense, one of the most advanced warships in the world. But she was also brand new, untested, untried. Her crew of 80-plus men included boys who had never heard a depth charge detonate underwater, and the old submarine officers in the wardroom bars at Pearl Harbor, the men who had survived the bad years of 1942. They looked at O'Kane's new command, and they smiled. They called her the Toy, not because she was small. She was not small. They called her the Toy because her commander was going to use her like one. Because Dick O'Kane was 32 years old, and he had learned everything he knew from a man who thought the Navy's tactical doctrine was written by cowards. Because they had heard how O'Kane liked to fire from under 1,000 yards. Because they had heard he wanted to attack on the surface at night, running his boat straight into the middle of enemy convoys like a wolf running into a herd of sheep. They said it would get him killed. They said it would get his crew killed. They said the ocean would teach him what the Naval Academy had not. Tang was placed in commission on the 15th of October, 1943, with Lieutenant Commander Richard H. O'Kane in command. 4 days earlier, on the 11th of October, on the other side of the world, in the narrow gray waters of the La Perouse Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, a Japanese Army bomber had spotted a submarine trying to slip out of the Sea of Japan. The bomber attacked. Depth charges from surface ships followed. The submarine went down with all 79 men aboard. The submarine was the USS Wahoo. The commanding officer was Dudley Morton. O'Kane did not know. Nobody knew. The Japanese did not announce it. The Navy waited and hoped, and eventually stopped hoping. For weeks, as O'Kane took his new command through her shakedown cruise down to San Diego, he wrote letters to his old captain that would never be answered. He carried the ghost of a man who was already dead. When the news finally reached him, the men who served under him said he did not talk about it. He only became quieter and more precise and more determined. The USS Tang departed Pearl Harbor on the 22nd of January, 1944, for her first war patrol. She headed for the waters around the Caroline and Mariana Islands, deep inside Japanese-controlled sea lanes. At dawn on the 17th of February, in the ocean about 130 miles west-northwest of Truk, the Tang made contact with a Japanese convoy. 2 freighters, 5 smaller ships, 4 escorts, the escort ship Amakusa, the submarine chaser Shirty 1, an auxiliary subchaser named Cha-24, a minesweeper called Hagoromo Maru. O'Kane tracked them. He worked the geometry the way Morton had taught him. And then an escort suddenly appeared at 7,000 yards, closing fast. The Tang went deep. 5 depth charges detonated in a rolling pattern above them. The hull groaned. The lights flickered. New sailors gripped the rails. The escort passed. The Tang came back up to periscope depth. O'Kane closed the range on the nearest freighter to 1,500 yards. The Navy manual called that reckless. He fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 3 of them struck the Japanese Army cargo ship Gyoten Maru. 6,854 tons of steel. She broke and sank by the stern. Later that same day, the Tang caught a merchant tanker called Convoy Maru and sent her to the bottom too. 5 nights later, on the 22nd of February, O'Kane came up on another convoy. 3 cargo ships, 4 escorts. He tracked them on the surface for half an hour. He closed to 1,500 yards off the port bow of the largest freighter. He fired 4 torpedoes. The Japanese ship Fukuyama Maru did not sink. It disintegrated. The lookouts posted on her deck were thrown into the air with the debris of their own vessel. The next morning, the Tang caught a small freighter called Ekizan Maru and put her under in 4 minutes. Then she caught another named Choko Maru and sank her too. By the time the Tang put into Midway Island to refit, she had fired 24 torpedoes and scored 16 hits. It was a percentage that made the veteran skippers at Pearl Harbor stop laughing. O'Kane stood on the deck of his boat in his stained khakis and watched his young crew hose down the salt. The toy submarine had just come home from her first patrol with the bones of 5 Japanese ships in her wake. And somewhere in the wardrooms of Pearl Harbor, the old officers who had smiled about O'Kane's tactics stopped smiling. Because the numbers were beginning to tell them something they did not want to hear. The man they had mocked was not going to die in the Pacific. He was going to change it. The Tang came home from her first patrol a legend, and the Navy did what the Navy always does with legends. It gave her another job. On the 16th of March, 1944, the Tang left Pearl Harbor for her second war patrol. She was ordered to the waters around Palau and Truk. She was told to hunt. For 6 weeks, she found nothing worth shooting. The Japanese had learned. After the beating the Tang had given them in February, they rerouted their convoys. They tightened their schedules. The sea lanes O'Kane knew were empty. His crew grew restless. They had come to fight, and the ocean gave them silence. And then, on the last day of April, the Tang was ordered to a new mission. Not a hunter's mission, a guardian's. The United States Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force was about to launch a massive airstrike against the Japanese fortress at Truk. American aircraft would be flying deep into enemy territory. Some of them were going to be shot down. Someone had to be there to pull the pilots out of the water. O'Kane got the assignment, lifeguard duty. He took the Tang to a position off Truk Lagoon, and he waited for 2 days and 3 nights in the shadow of a Japanese naval base. The USS Tang surfaced again and again to pluck downed American flyers out of the sea. 22 of them, pilots and gunners and radio men from Hellcats and Avengers and Kingfisher float planes. One of them, an aviator named John Burns, was flying an OS-2U Kingfisher so loaded with rescued men that he could not take off. He taxied his damaged aircraft across open water while Japanese shore batteries dropped shells around him, and the Tang came alongside and took his passengers off his hands. O'Kane packed 22 extra men into a submarine designed for 80. He cut every man's food ration in half. He turned his boat around and he drove home. He was awarded the Legion of Merit. His crew was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for the first 3 patrols combined. But in the wardrooms of Pearl Harbor, some of the old admirals shook their heads. The best submarine skipper in the Pacific had just spent an entire patrol as a rescue taxi. They wanted him killing ships, not saving pilots. O'Kane heard the whispers. He said nothing. He refit his boat. He waited for his next patrol. On the 8th of June, 1944, the Tang left Pearl Harbor and pointed her bow at the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. This was the front porch of the Japanese home islands, the most heavily patrolled water on Earth. American submarines went in there and did not come out. O'Kane went in there anyway. On the 24th of June, southwest of Kagoshima, the Tang made radar contact with a Japanese convoy. 6 large ships, 16 escorts, a ratio that would have sent most American submarine commanders diving deep and running the other way. O'Kane closed on the surface, in darkness on his diesel engines. 20 knots. He put the Tang inside the convoy, not alongside it, inside it, between the columns of merchant ships where the escorts could not fire at him without hitting their own charges. He fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at one ship. Then, without waiting to see the hits, he swung his tubes toward a second target and fired 3 more. In the space of a single night, in a single running engagement, the USS Tang put 4 Japanese ships on the bottom of the East China Sea. The Tamahoko Maru, the Tainan Maru, the Nasusan Maru, the Kenichi Maru. By the end of that patrol, O'Kane had sunk 10 Japanese vessels in one deployment. It was the highest single patrol total of any American submarine in the entire Pacific War. But there was something O'Kane did not know that night. Something no one on the Tang knew. The Tamahoko Maru was a prisoner transport. She was carrying 772 Allied prisoners of war. Australians, British, Dutch, Americans, men who had survived the fall of Singapore and Java and the Philippines, men who had endured 2 years of Japanese captivity and were being shipped to the home islands as slave labor. When O'Kane's torpedoes struck her, she went down in less than 2 minutes. 560 of those prisoners drowned in the dark water off Kyushu. 212 were pulled from the sea by Japanese escorts and put back into camps. The Japanese did not mark their prisoner ships. There were no Red Cross symbols on the hulls. There was no way for O'Kane to know. The men who sank those hell ships almost out after the war ended, when the paperwork caught up with them, when the survivors came home and told their stories. O'Kane would carry the Tamahoko Maru with him for the rest of his life. The Tang went out again on the 31st of July, 1944. Her fourth war patrol. This time, O'Kane took her into the home waters of Japan itself, off the coast of Honshu, so close to shore that his lookouts could smell the pine forests. He sank the Roko Maru. He sank the Nansadu Maru No. 2. He sank the Nanko Maru No. 8. He sank the Tsukushi Maru. He sank 2 patrol craft that came out to hunt him. The Tang was awarded a second Presidential Unit citation. In 4 patrols, she had sunk 17 ships. Her commanding officer had become the most successful submarine skipper of the war. And before her 5th patrol, the ordnance men at Pearl Harbor loaded her with a brand new weapon, the Mark 18 electric torpedo. For 2 years, American submariners had cursed the Mark 14. It ran too deep. It exploded early. It refused to explode at all. The Mark 18 was supposed to be the answer. It was electric. It made no bubbles. It left no wake. An enemy lookout would never see it coming. But the Mark 18 had a flaw: its gyroscope. If the gyro drifted even slightly, if the internal steering mechanism failed, the torpedo would curve. It would circle. And it would come back. On the 26th of March, 1944, in the waters off Palau, a submarine called the USS Tulibi had launched 2 Mark 18s at a Japanese transport. One of the torpedoes had circled back. It had struck the Tulibi amidships. She had gone down in less than a minute. Of her 80-man crew, 1 man survived. A gunner's mate named Cliff Kuykendall, who had been blown clear off the bridge and spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp. The Bureau of Ordnance said the circular run problem was rare, acceptable, statistically insignificant. O'Kane took 24 Mark 18s aboard the Tang and left Pearl Harbor on the 24th of September, 1944, for his 5th war patrol. He refueled at Midway. He was offered a choice. He could join a coordinated attack group of 3 other submarines patrolling northeast of Formosa, or he could go it alone through the narrow mined waters north of the island. O'Kane chose to go alone. On the 10th and 11th of October, in the Formosa Strait, the Tang caught 2 Japanese cargo ships and sent them to the bottom. And then, on the night of the 23rd of October, she found the convoy that would define everything. 3 tankers, a transport, a freighter, a screen of escorts. It was moving along the China coast, hugging the shallow water, running for the home islands with a cargo that the Empire could not afford to lose. O'Kane surfaced. He put the Tang between the tankers on the surface. At night, the Japanese saw him. 2 of the tankers turned to ram him. O'Kane ordered a hard turn. The Tang slid between them, and the 2 Japanese tankers, both moving at full speed, both aimed at the same small piece of ocean, collided with each other. Steel screamed against steel. Fuel oil ignited. The night lit up. Across 2 separate night engagements. From the darkness of the 23rd of October into the early morning hours of the 25th, the USS Tang tore that convoy apart. She fired her torpedoes until she had 2 left. She sank 6 ships in that engagement. She left the survivors clinging to burning wreckage across 2 miles of sea. At 2:30 in the morning on the 25th of October, O'Kane brought his boat around one final time. There was a crippled transport still moving, barely making steerageway, bleeding smoke. He would put his last 2 torpedoes into her, and he would go home. He would go home a legend. He fired the 23rd torpedo. It ran straight. He fired the 24th. It did not. 20 seconds is not a long time. It is one breath. It is the space between a decision and its consequence. It is how long the tongue had left. Boatswain's mate William Leibold, 21 years old, saw the wake bend first. He was standing at the port lookout station on the bridge. He had been at sea long enough to know what a straight-running torpedo looked like. This one was not straight. It was curving. It was coming back. O'Kane was on him in an instant. He saw it. Every man on that bridge saw it. There was no confusion. There was no hesitation. There was only the sudden, cold understanding that 8 seconds was not enough time to move a 300-foot submarine out of the path of its own weapon. O'Kane shouted the order down the hatch. Ahead flank, right full rudder. The diesels roared. The Tang heeled over, and the Mark 18 torpedo, running at 29 knots, struck her portside aft. The explosion tore the tongue open. The 3 rear compartments flooded in seconds. The stern dropped like a stone. The bow reared up out of the water, black against the burning horizon, and then the whole boat began to slide backward into the sea. 9 men were on the bridge when the torpedo struck. O'Kane was thrown into the water. So was Leibold. So was radar technician Floyd Caverly. In the conning tower just below them, Lieutenant Lawrence Savadkin found an air bubble in a flooding compartment, held his breath, and clawed his way out through a hatch as the boat went down. Those 4 men would keep themselves afloat for the next 8 hours in the black water of the Formosa Strait. The other 5 men from the bridge went into the sea and were never seen again. The Tang settled on the bottom of the Formosa Strait at 180 feet. Inside her forward compartments, 30 men were still alive. They gathered in the forward torpedo room. Injured men were carried. The senior surviving officer, Lieutenant Hank Flanagan, took charge. They sealed the watertight doors behind them. They knew what came next. The Japanese destroyers came next. For hours, depth charges rolled across the sea above them. The men in the torpedo room could hear the propellers overhead. They could hear the splash of each canister hitting the water. They could hear the click of the depth fuses arming, and then the concussion, over and over. The hull rang like a struck bell. A fire started in the forward battery compartment. Paint on the bulkheads began to blister. It ran down the walls in slow, melting streaks. Smoke crept under the watertight door and pooled at the deck. The men tore up publications. They fed the code books into the flames of their own dying submarine, one page at a time, because that was their duty. At 6 a.m, they began to leave. Every American submarine carried an escape device. It was called the Momsen lung. It had been designed in the early 1930s by a submarine officer named Charles Momsen, who had watched too many friends die in bottomed boats. The lung was a simple rebreather, a rubber bag, a mouthpiece, a soda lime canister to scrub carbon dioxide. In peacetime training, men had used it to escape from 100 feet, from 150 feet. In wartime combat, it had never been used successfully. That morning, aboard the USS Tang, it was used for the only time in the entire Second World War. They went up through the forward escape trunk. 4 men at a time. They flooded the trunk. They equalized the pressure. They opened the outer hatch. They pulled themselves up the escape line, one hand over the other, into 180 feet of black water, breathing from a rubber bag while their eardrums bled and their lungs screamed. 13 men made it out of the submarine. Only 5 of them reached the surface alive. The others lost the line, or panicked, or ran out of air, or surfaced too fast and were killed by embolism before they could take a breath of open sky. Of the 87 men who had gone to sea on the USS Tang, 78 of them stayed in the Formosa Strait forever. 9 came home. The Japanese destroyer that pulled the survivors from the water was one of the escorts from the convoy the Tang had destroyed the night before. The men on that destroyer had spent the last 12 hours watching their comrades burn. They had listened to the screams of their own sailors in the water. They had counted the dead. And now, out of the dawn came 9 American submariners in oil-soaked coveralls, and the Japanese crew knew exactly who they were. They were beaten on the deck. They were beaten in the passageways. They were beaten by men who had just lost brothers and shipmates and childhood friends to torpedoes that these same Americans had fired. The survivors were taken to a place called Ofuna, near Yokohama. Ofuna was not a prisoner of war camp. Not officially. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built it specifically to interrogate high-value captives outside the reach of the Red Cross. There were no inspections. There were no records. The men held there simply did not exist. For 10 months, Richard O'Kane and his 8 surviving crewmen were beaten, starved, questioned, and beaten again. They were denied medical care. They were denied names. They were fed cups of watery rice and left to freeze through the winter in unheated cells. O'Kane weighed 180 pounds when the Tang went down. By August of 1945, he weighed less than 90. On the 5th of February, 1945, the United States Navy officially declared the USS Tang lost, presumed sunk by enemy action. All hands presumed dead. The telegram reached a house in California. Ernestine Groves O'Kane was 32 years old. She had 2 small children. She read the words that said her husband was gone, and she did not believe them. She wrote letters that had nowhere to be delivered. She waited. In September of 1945, after the Japanese surrender, American forces liberated Ofuna. They found 9 skeletal men in the compound where the Navy's records said no Americans were being held. Richard O'Kane came home. His wife met him when he came home. Fellow prisoners from Ofuna later said their own families struggled to recognize them at first sight. The men who came back from that camp did not look like the men who had gone away. In March of 1946, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Richard O'Kane's neck in a ceremony at the White House. By the war's end, the official credit given to the USS Tang was 24 Japanese ships sunk. In 1980, after decades of careful review of captured Japanese shipping records by naval historians and Tang's surviving officers, the number was revised. 33 ships, 116,454 tons, more ships than any other American submarine in the history of the United States Navy. All of them sunk in less than 10 months of combat operations by 1 boat and 1 crew, under 1 commanding officer. The United States submarine force in the Second World War made up less than 2% of the Navy's total personnel. It sank more than 55% of every Japanese vessel that went to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. 2 million tons of merchant shipping. 201 warships. It cut Japan's oil supply. It starved her factories. It broke the back of the empire long before the atomic bombs fell. It cost 22% of the men who went to sea in those boats. Higher casualties than any other branch of the American armed forces in the entire war. Richard O'Kane retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral. He died on the 16th of February, 1994, at the age of 83, and he was buried at the Naval Academy at Annapolis, where his career had begun 60 years before. William Leibold, the boatswain's mate, who had stood on the bridge beside O'Kane on the last night of the Tang, lived until the summer of 2024. He was the last man alive who had been on the Tang the night she went down. He was 99 years old when he passed. 80 years, almost to the day, after the sea took his ship. They called her the toy submarine when she left Pearl Harbor. In 10 months, she made the ocean remember her name. The Japanese did teach a lesson that year, but it was not the lesson they had planned.